Hello, and thank you for tuning in to my on-demand presentation. My name is Daniel Warner. I work at the Delaware Geological Survey, along with co-PIs John Callahan and Tom McKenna. We're going to discuss some recent work we did with mapping and modeling blue carbon storage in Delaware coastal wetlands. This work was also made possible through collaborations with the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserves in Blackbird and St. Jones rivers. So we know that marshes provide a lot of ecosystem services, and the one that we're going to focus on here is their ability to store and accumulate lots of organic carbon. Marshes can do this because they have relatively high plant productivity, but also very slow decomposition. Because they're periodically flooded, they have very low oxygen content in their soils. Unfortunately, this storage is difficult to estimate because it varies in space and with depth and also laterally. This variability is driven by differences in hydrology, where the water is coming from and how long different parts of the marsh remain inundated. It can be driven by different types of vegetation, where the species have colonized. And it's dictated by differences in chemical and sediment inputs, what's coming in from the tide and what's coming in from the uplands that drain through the marsh. Our key questions for this work were, can we map organic matter storage across the marsh platform using a mixture of field observations and remote sensing products? A basic question of how much organic carbon is stored in our study areas, which were the Blackbird Creek Marsh, you can see that on the top, and the St. Jones River Marsh down on the bottom. And finally, we wanted to know, what can we infer about the vulnerability of carbon storage in these marshes based on the spatial patterns that we find? So a key component of this work was collecting point observations of sediment chemistry that we could use to estimate organic matter and organic carbon content. We used two data sets. One was already collected by the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserves. This was mostly done by boat, so a lot of the samples came along major channel areas. And then we also collected some samples mostly accessed by foot, so these would be more in the marsh interior and along the fringe. And by doing this, we accumulated a good data set that reflected a lot of different positions within the ecosystems. Once we extracted the cores with a hand auger, we segmented them into 0 to 30 centimeter pieces, 40 to 60 centimeter, and 70 to 90 centimeters. These samples were then dried, and we measured organic matter content using loss on ignition, which is where you heat it up to 550 degrees Celsius and burn off all the organic carbon while retaining inorganic fractions. We also looked at total elemental analysis and got total carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur content. Some samples were retained from the loss on ignition and analyzed for carbon content, so we could estimate inorganic carbon and then back calculate the amount of organic carbon that we had in each sample. We also dried the samples and calculated their bulk density based on their core volume and dry weight. The second main data source we used was various remote sensing products. This included terrain data, such as elevation, slope, ruggedness, detrended DEM, which is when you remove large-scale trends from an elevation data set, as well as the Euclidean distance to the channel network. We also looked at National Agricultural Imagery Program data, NAIP, and used that to calculate spectral vegetation indices like the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, the GCI, and the CP. In the end, we ran a variable selection process to identify robust predictors that were not autocorrelated, and we ended up with our final predictor set of elevation, Euclidean distance to the channel, and the NDVI. So every core we collected had high precision GPS coordinates associated with it. So we could take those observations and extract the corresponding spatial data, the NDVI, elevation, and Euclidean distance to channel at each of these spots. And then we investigated several different statistical modeling methods to be able to model the organic matter density, which is expressed in kilograms per square meter of the upper 30 centimeter of marsh. The models we considered were a general linear model, a random forests model, which is a decision tree-based regression, a k-nearest neighbors model, and a neural network. The final predictors were chosen based on the contribution to the preliminary model performance. So that's how we ended up with our 3 predictor variables. The final model we ended up using was a multiple linear regression. Many of the models performed pretty similarly, and linear regressions are generally easy to understand and interpret, so we went with the simpler model. It had a mean absolute error of 6.1 kilograms per meter squared of organic matter density, and an R squared of 0.28. Although the random forest model performed a little bit better, it was very heavily weighted to the Euclidean distance predictor, and when we ended up extrapolating it, it produced really weird looking patterns and strange artifacts, so we did not consider it for the final predictions. Although we mapped organic matter density, we ended up estimating carbon density based on the percentage of carbon from our elemental analysis. As we mentioned, we measured total carbon in our samples and total carbon of the ashed residuals after we ran loss on ignition and used that to calculate organic carbon. We ended up with a value of 41.5% of all organic matter we sampled was pure carbon. So after we ended up fitting our statistical models, we extrapolated them across our entire study area using those spatial covariate layers that we used as predictors. So on the left, we can see Blackbird Marsh, and on the right, we see St. John's. One clear pattern that you see is that we found higher carbon storage in areas that were closer to the channels and areas that were closer to the shore, which are generally a little higher elevation, the areas that are truly considered the high marsh. In the end, we estimated that Blackbird and St. John's marshes store 70 and 79 gigagrams of organic carbon in their top 30 centimeters. We know this is an underestimate. The deeper layers we considered at 40 and 70 centimeters also stored a lot of carbon. Unfortunately, our models had a very difficult time fitting any sort of spatial pattern to these deeper carbon storage layers. And even beyond those deeper layers, we know that in some places marsh sediments can be really thick, up to a couple meters. So a key target for future research is not only understanding the concentration and storage of carbon in these deeper layers, but also the three-dimensional structure of the marsh sediment deposits themselves. Being able to get a better picture of how thick the sediment is in different areas will really help us make a better estimate of how much carbon is stored in total in one of these ecosystems. We also found that carbon storage was highest in high marsh areas near the shore and near major channels. Although these areas are less frequently inundated, which might suggest they might be less vulnerable to erosion and washing out, these areas are also areas where boats will drive through very quickly and produce large wakes. So an ecosystem management consideration might be trying to reduce the potential impacts of boat wakes as they may undercut the sediment banks and cause bank slumping, which leads to a lot of erosion of potential carbon storage. And with that, I'd like to thank the Delaware Estuarian Research Reserves, particularly Carrie St. Laurent. She was very helpful and a great collaborator on this project. I'd also like to thank DENREC and the City of Dover, who helped get us site access for some of these managed marsh areas. I'm happy to collaborate and discuss this work more. If you'd like to reach out, my email is warnerdl@udel.edu. Thank you.